Thank you, band. Good to have Gary back. Woo, keyboards were smoking there, buddy. I did think it was funny. He went down to Cozumel, and we were all enjoying one of the warmest Februarys ever. Payback right there. Hi, I'm John Mason Smith. I'm on the remote ministry team here at the Flora-Bama Church. Hey, by that I mean, and especially if you're about to fly away, snowbird. Hey, we keep up with you all week long, every week while you're gone. Once a week, we send you out an email that has a link to the program and also the video. And just to tell you how great the weather is, you'll get that if you sign up for the remote ministry. To do that, you'll need the program. You should have a program right now. And if you don't and you need one, I got a volunteer to run one out to you. Just stick your hands up in the air if you need a program, because you're going to need it for a lot this week. All right, nobody needs it. Check. All right, we have great greeters. All right, so first off, let's give our first-time guests a big hand. Thank you for coming today. That's a big deal. Hey, we have a motto up there. It's up there on the sign that it's okay to not be okay. And by that, we mean you're welcome just as you are. And we got a good look at some of you, and it's still true. Just as you are. Hey, we have a couple things coming up, and some of these are in your program. We have Celebrate Recovery. We're very excited about our explosion in Celebrate Recovery. We didn't feel like we could do a ministry in a bar if we didn't deal with some of the issues that come along with life in general. And we do that through Celebrate Recovery. The information is in your program. It's a fantastic, growing program, and we meet over at the Wharf every Sunday night. And you can learn more by just looking into your program. If you have any questions, you can also email Rick Long. His information is on the back of the program as well. And so we have a really big event coming up. It's the Super Bowl of Christianity. It's called Easter. Everybody wanted to know, when are you going to do Easter? Well, here's your announcement. We're doing Easter on Easter Sunday. Yes, April 1st this year. I don't know, how many people were here for Easter last year? Just raise your hand up. All right, more epic. We actually found a bigger tent. We had the biggest tent in the Southeast, going to be out there on the bar. It'll go from the water to the bar. It's going to be huge. Yeah. Listen, tell everybody about Easter at the Flora-Bama. We had over 4,000 last year. You guys can even bring more. And all you got to do is stop by the information table. For today, we brought a bunch of these cards, or invitation cards, to come to Easter. I don't care if you live in Jonesboro. I don't care if you live in Louisiana. I don't care if you live in Birmingham, because guess what? They're on spring break during Easter. Take all these cards with you and hand them out to everyone you know. Invite them to come to the Flora-Bama. We'll have room for them, and we'll do it on the beach. We're very excited for it. It is a wonderful celebration of why we're Christians, and it is one of those things that has just become a sensation across the whole Southeast to go to the Flora-Bama for Easter. So we would love for you to come join us in that celebration. I'm pretty excited by it, obviously. I'm pumped. I'm just looking at how the spring breaks are lining up this year with this early Easter, and it's going to be amazing. Hey, if you have a prayer request, something's going on in your life, grab one of these off our information tables. They're located on each side of the building as the info tables, and it's a next step card. You can give us a prayer request. You can also use this to sign up for baptism. You want to serve here, we can use a lot of servers. If you want to join one of our classes on ownership, we call that First Step. That's going on right now. We would love to have you sign up. Fill that out, and when you're done, you can put it in our giving stations. That's a place where you can also give an offering. Our giving station is located left over there, or for you, right? Left over there. And then also out on the way out, you'll see a giving station. Upstairs in the main bar, there's one in the back of the room. They're listening to us right now, in case you didn't know that, on video. and you can put your offering in there. Thank you for all your offerings. We use that to do one purpose, really, and it's to introduce people to Jesus and help them follow him. If you do want to give by credit card or debit, you can do that at that info table over there. We have a little machine that can do that. I'm going to invite everyone here to stand up. Those that are smart will go into the info table and grab some invite cards first. Find someone you don't know and wish them a good morning.
I love this next song. It's all about the name of Jesus. Sing along. As morning dawns and evening fades, you inspire songs of praise that rise from earth to touch your heart and glorify your name. Your name is a strong and mighty tower. Your name is a shelter like no other. Your name, let the nations sing it louder, 'cause nothing has the power to change your name. Praise your name today, O Lord. Give you glory and praise. Jesus, in your name we pray. Come and fill our hearts today. Lord, give us strength to live for you and glorify your name. Your name is a strong and mighty tower. Your name is a shelter like no other. Your name, let the nations sing it louder, 'cause nothing has the power to save. But your name is a strong and mighty tower. Your name is the no other. Your name, let the nations sing it louder, 'cause nothing has the power to save. Let's go sing Jesus. Jesus, 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 your name. 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 Your name is the strong and mighty tower. Your name is a shelter like no other. Your name, let the nations sing it louder, 'cause nothing has the power to save. Your name is a strong and mighty tower. Your name is a shelter like no other. Your name, let the nations sing it louder, 'cause nothing has the power to save. Your name, your name. power in his name. Amen.
Oh, thank you guys. Well, good morning, everybody. You guys feeling all right this morning? Feeling good? We're so glad you all are here. If we haven't met yet, my name is Dan. I'm the pastor here at the Flora-Bama, and I'm so glad you're hanging out with us here and then up in the main bar as well. And I think we even got some people over in the bra room. Yeah, so we've been in a series of conversations, if you haven't been here, on what it means to be Christian. How many guys have been in on a couple of those? A few of them? All right, good. It's been awesome. Coming from the guy talking, you know. But it's been a really interesting conversation because we've been looking at it, what it actually means and what the word Christian actually means. And I don't want to spend, a bunch of time going over the last several weeks, but there's this really great verse in the Bible that I want to read. And if you guys have got your program, go ahead and open it up. All the verses that we're going to be reading are in there. If you snuck in since our host time and you don't have a program, just shoot your hand up. We'll make sure you get one. But before the word Christian was even thrown around, there was this idea of what it meant to be Christian. It kind of is summed up in the book of Romans, chapter 14. It's the very first verse in your program. And here's what it says. The writer of Romans, a man named Paul, is writing to a group of Christians in Rome, and he says this: "For we don't live for ourselves or die for ourselves. If we live, it's to honor the Lord, and if we die, it's to honor the Lord. So whether we live or whether we die, we belong to the Lord." And there was this group of people in the very first century that their lives so belonged to Jesus Christ and to his teachings that other people started looking at them and calling them Christian, or those people belong to Christ. This isn't a word that the church itself invented. It didn't rise up within religious gatherings. Jesus never used the phrase Christian. It was never meant to be a term used to name a club that people joined. It was a description of a person's life. Someone whose life so belonged to Christ that there was no other word to describe them. And so we've talked about what does it look like for a person's life to belong to Christ. So this is the very last week of this series of conversations. I'm really excited about it because I want to talk about a specific interaction that Jesus had with a young man. Now this interaction you can find in two places in the Bible. You can find it in the book of Luke. Luke was written by a first century physician doctor named Luke. He was not one of the disciples, but he was one of the writers of the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the second place you can find it is in the book of Mark. Now, no one place to read the story is better than the other. We're just going to take a look at the book of Mark. And interestingly enough, Mark was not one of the original disciples. Mark, though he may have come to Christ, come to follow Christ during Christ's life, he eventually became like a disciple of Peter. And much of what is written in the book of Mark is Peter's remembrance and Peter's description of Jesus' life on the earth. And Mark is 16 chapters. Listen, if you took a chapter today, you could knock that book of Mark out between now and almost next week when we gather together. It's a great place to read, and it's a great place to start if you're not a big Bible reader. Now, we're going to start in the book of Mark chapter 10. So you got your program, open it up. We're going to read, it looks like a whole bunch of verses, but they're all sequential. We're going to read about this interesting interaction Jesus had with this young man. Now, in the book of Mark and in the book of Luke, neither one actually names who this young man is. We don't have any idea who he is, but we know he had a very, very real interaction with Jesus. And here's what it says. The book of Mark chapter 10 verse 17, it says, "As Jesus was starting out on his way to Jerusalem," now we've got to picture this back in the day, Jesus is taking a walk, right? He's not waiting for a bus or, about to on the plane or anything like that, or getting his car. Jesus is walking to Jerusalem, and along the walk he meets a man, and the man came running up to him, knelt down and said, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Pretty good question, right? That's a pretty great question to ask, actually. Now, Jesus engages in a conversation with him, and he as I'm sure this young man was expecting, Jesus starts telling him what he needs to do. But he's coming at it from the perspective of the law. Now, this young man and Jesus had, growing up in the culture that they grew up in, we were judged, humanity was judged based on some commandments, right? If you do these numbers of things, you're in. If you don't do these numbers of things, you're not in. You don't get to be in the crowd. And then, even if you do those things, I do them better, therefore I'm more God's favorite than you are. Now, that's 2,000 years ago that this whole idea that you have to be a certain thing to be in was around, and 2,000 years later, we still find that idea in some religious communities, that if you'll do this, this, and this, then you can get in. Then you can get in. And you may be in, but you're not as good as me. You know what I'm saying? You've done some stuff, but let me tell you a little bit about how great I am. And so this conversation ensues with Jesus and this young man about the things that he knows he's already supposed to do. Matter of fact, Jesus starts naming off some of the commandments. Now, here's the young man's response in verse 20. But he said, well, I've obeyed all this commandments since I was young. I've jumped through every hoop, Jesus, that can possibly jump through. And I haven't just started doing it recently. I've done it since I was a kid. I've done it since I was a kid. So at some point when this young man was a kid, there was a list of rules laid out for him and was told, if you do these, then you're good to go. You're good to go, right? Now some of you do, I don't have a big church upbringing. I didn't grow up attending church very consistently at all. And when we did, it was just maybe, because it was a holiday or because we had this really religious uncle. And so when he came to town, I was like, we better go to church. Uncle's coming into town, And so we would do it, but it was all for kind of just the tradition of the thing. But I did know, even then, even having not a lot of church background or a lot of church knowledge or no Bible knowledge whatsoever, that there were some rules I needed to follow or some hoops I needed to jump through. And the people that jumped through them were kind of the in group of people. I wasn't one of those people. And I felt, even as a kid, and I'm talking maybe 10, 11, 12 years old, I can remember thinking, I'm on the outside of this like holy group of people. And I didn't blame my parents for not taking me. I didn't think I was some evil person, but it was very obvious to me that a certain group of people were in, and the Stone family was not in that group, We made mistakes, and I figured all the bad stuff we did in our lives disqualified us from being in, right? And we definitely didn't attend that religious thing all the time either. And so that really kind of put us on the outside. I mean, I can remember walking in and getting, not nowhere near the number of people that are here today, and just kind of getting one of these looks like, this is the new people. And Jesus is kind of regurgitating back the stuff that this kid has been told his whole life. And he's like, hey, good. I'm good. I've been doing all this stuff, Lord, since I was a kid. And then Jesus then follows up, because the kid now thinks he's good. Man, I've done all that stuff. I've obeyed all the commandments. And here's how Jesus follows up. Looking at the man, Jesus felt a genuine love for him. Very interesting to me, before we go on, that this writer, Mark, felt that necessary to add. Felt that necessary to add. We'll come back to that in just a minute. But here's what it says. There is still one thing you haven't done. Oh, hold on, right? I've done it all. I've completed all the tasks. I've jumped through every hoop. And Jesus, I didn't just start last week, and I've been doing it forever. He said, there's still one thing that you haven't done, he said. And then he drops this crazy bomb on him. Go and sell all your possessions, give the money to the poor, and you will have treasures in heaven, and then come follow me. And then he just stops. I thought this whole thing was supposed to be way easier than that. Like, don't murder people, Try not to lie, steal from people. And then Jesus drops this crazy bomb on him from the perspective of love. He wasn't doing it as a judgmental thing, but he says, hey, all this stuff you got, what if you went and sold all of it, took the money that you got from it, gave it to poor people, and then you decided to come follow me. And then here's the very next verse, the end of the interaction that Jesus has. Whether you read it out of Mark and Luke, it's the same phrase. And this man's face fell, and he went away sad, for he had many possessions. It's a very interesting story, isn't it? It's a very interesting story. And it's always a very interesting story to talk about in church, because there's money involved in this story, and we're in church, and we all know that the only thing the church really wants is our money. So it's a weird conversation to have, right? And now we're going to pass the plates. No, we're not. But it's this very interesting interaction, isn't it? There's all the hoops that this kid has been told about his whole life. Now, I don't know, I have no idea what your religious background is, and if you did have one, what you thought about it. I don't know if you agreed with your spiritual religious upbringing, or if you disagree with your spiritual religious upbringing, but no matter what, in every upbringing, and it doesn't include just the Christian religion, there are hoops and rules that are laid out for us, and those things are beautiful. Several months ago, we did a whole series on the 10 Commandments. And the perception of what those commandments are and what they're not, and how freeing they actually are. But everyone's got some ideas of what it means to be Christian and what hoop you have to jump through. And the weird thing about the Christian religion is that depending on which gathering you go to, everyone seems to have their own hoops. How annoying is that? You thought you jumped through the right hoops until you had to move and find a new gathering, and they've got some of the old ones and some different hoops to get through. And that's what this kid kind of runs into. He is so glad. I can imagine on his mind, oh, I've jumped through all the hoops my whole life. I've kept all the commandments. And then Jesus lays them out. Hey, you know what to do. You're supposed to do this, 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 and this. What a relief. What a relief that I just checked the boxes. And I've been checking them. Now, we don't know how old this young man is, but let's just say years. He's been checking those boxes for years. What a relief off this kid. And then Jesus, so this kid's ready to go, right? Oh, I did it. Let's go. And he says, oh, hold on. Out of love, out of this heart of amazing love, Jesus says to him, but there's one thing you haven't done yet. There's one thing you haven't done yet. Now, let's just pretend for a moment that the conversation was not about money at all. Now, obviously, there was money involved in the conversation, but let's just take away the middle part of the conversation. We've got the first part. Let's go to the end. And he said, verse 22 there at the bottom, and this man's face fell and he went away sad. Whatever they were talking about, now we know what it was, but let's just pause that. Whatever they were talking about, this young man was not willing to do or give up, or whatever it was, whatever hoop it was, he wasn't willing to jump through. It had come to a line, and Jesus asked him to cross a line he was not willing to cross. He was not willing to cross. What Jesus was really after was more than this young man's money, because if you'll notice, who does he say to give the money to? Yeah, not to him. Jesus doesn't want this man's money. He doesn't say, go sell it all and please dial this number and send your money into my ministry. That's not the conversation. The conversation actually has very little to do with Jesus until the end, where he says, come follow me. But first, what Jesus was after was finding out where this kid's line was on what he was willing to do or what he's willing to give up. And then beyond that, he was really trying to find out, Jesus was trying to locate this young man on what had this young man's heart. Obviously, the commandments weren't a problem for this kid's heart. Those were really great. But he went away sad. Now we have to find out why he went away sad. He was sad because he had great possessions. He had a whole bunch of stuff, and he was not willing to let that go to follow Christ. Now, I want to pause here before we go on, because there's been a lot of damage done in people's lives with this interaction that Jesus had. there has been guilt and, guilt and shame and all kinds of things that have been piled up on people trying to get people to give their money, to the point where Jesus is probably asking you too to sell all you have. And it's usually not give it to the poor. It's usually to give it to somebody who's also the one saying that they should give it, And there's been a lot of hurt and harm done in the name of Christ and in the name of this story to add guilt and shame to people so that someone else can get rich and then that person is left without anything. And there's a whole layer of issues with that way of conversation or that kind of preaching. But let me tell you what the whole point they're missing. This story is less about money and possessions and more about the fact that the man that Jesus happened to be interacting with had a great desire to keep security and wealth for himself. And so Jesus was not speaking this arbitrarily. He was directing it at a certain individual. But within that certain individual lies a very, very powerful truth. There is a danger in anything that we own owning us. There's a massive danger in it. There's a massive danger to the point where there could be a moment, and there was for this young man, there was a moment where the stuff that he owned him to the point where it was not worth giving up to follow Jesus. And it's not a blanket statement for all of us here today, but it is a blanket truth. Stuff may not have your heart, but stuff may have your heart. But one thing is for sure, Jesus is after to find out what are the things that have our heart. It's very interesting to me, whenever I read the Bible, I always ask myself a couple of questions. But one of them is, why would that writer, of all the stuff Jesus did, why did Mark, for example, include this story when he could have written 100 other stories? I mean, we only have a few stories of Jesus' life. Mark, only 16 chapters worth of Jesus' life. I mean, obviously, if you followed around Jesus every minute, every day, you'd have more than 16 chapters worth of writings. So why did Mark want to include this story? Because I think there's something profound about the question that would you be willing, and then for this young man it was, would you be willing to give all you had away to those in need and then come follow me? But the real question is, would you be willing to, and then you fill in the blank for you, and then come follow me? Because Jesus was not trying to get this young man to follow another rule. He looked at him with love. He was after this young man's heart. And at the end of the day, when all the smoke clears, being a Christian is really about Christ having the center place in our heart. And that's what Jesus was after. Now, you could start in the book of Matthew, which is the very first book of the New Testament. You could read Matthew. You could go on to this book, Mark. You could read Luke. You could read John. You could read those 4 accounts of Jesus' life, the Gospels. And you will notice an overarching theme, which is the theme of this story. Jesus, somehow, no matter what the conversation is, he had this very clever way of kind of weeding through all the BS and getting to the heart of the situation. Am I allowed to say that? Yeah. Okay. Well, I said it. So. He had a great way to weed through all the stuff, the nonsense, and get to the heart of the person. And he very rarely argued about theology and church politics and voting on this and that. He very rarely, if ever, engaged in those kinds of conversations, but he was often included in those conversations because they were always trying to ask him stuff, stuff that didn't matter whatsoever. And so Jesus would weed through all that, and then he would get involved in the people's lives and get to their heart. Not the heart of the matter. He would get to the heart of the person. And I think the question Jesus is really asking this young man is, hey, is there something in your hearts that has taken precedence over following Jesus? Now, for this young man, there was something. There was something. There was something that when push came to shove, there was not a willingness to let go of to follow Jesus. The conversation ended. He asked no follow-up questions. He didn't try to argue the point. He just walked away. He just walked away. Because there was something that was asked that was not willing to be given. I think it's a really good question to ask. And I think it's the only way over the last few weeks that we can end this series of conversations on what it really means for your life to belong to Christ, because we could talk about finances, we could talk about the commandments, we could talk about any of that stuff, but if our hearts don't belong to Christ, then it doesn't do any good to have those other second layer conversations. Does that make sense? There's all these conversations we could be asking. Well, does money have your heart, or does Christ have your heart? Okay, we could name all of these things. We can name all these things that could have your heart. We can make a list. And my guess is we all have some things that we could have listed from our past, or that maybe currently is going on right now, that we'd have a hard time giving up if God were to actually ask us to give it up. Or we would not even, well, God would never ask me to give that up. We wouldn't even think that he would give it up because we don't really want to. But all of those things, our lists, are insignificant. The real question is, does Christ have our heart? And if Christ has our heart, then those other things can't. Those other things can't. And I wonder if we're asking ourselves questions backwards, right? Or if we've come to our faith kind of in a backwards way. Well, if you will start attending the church, then you will find God, and then you can give Christ your heart. And then the next layer is, well, if you start believing a certain way about the Bible in a certain way, then Christ will have your heart. Or maybe another layer is, if you start behaving in a certain way and you start coming to church and then you start reading more and praying more, then Christ can have your heart. I think we sometimes even enter our Christian faith backwards. We go through hoops to get to Christ instead of going to Christ, and then because he has the supreme spot in our heart, then all that other stuff just starts to fall into place. Then our money conversations aren't about greed anymore, it's about generosity. And then our conversations about coming to church and reading and praying become less about something we're required to do and more about the fact that, well, Christ is in me and I want to start talking to him. I think sometimes we learn Christianity backwards. Jesus ends up with our heart, but first he starts with our actions. And he gets all of our actions right, and we obey the 10 Commandments correctly, or at least in front of people. Especially when they're watching, or especially on Sunday morning, God bless you. We tend to be really good at doing it right, but how many of you have ever been around someone, they smiled and they looked great, but you knew something was, especially if you know somebody really well, they're off on the inside, right? Have you ever, I dare ask, have you ever put on the face yourself? When things weren't good on the inside, but you smiled at people and you saw someone in line at the store and they said, hey, how you doing? And your answer, everything in you wanted to scream, horrible, and you said, great. Yeah, of course, we're pretty good at that. So why would we think sometimes our faith is any different? That we've done all of these things, but the truth is sometimes Christ doesn't have our heart. He has our actions. And listen, don't get me wrong, I think that's really good. I don't think it's good to go around, lying to people and killing them. I think those are bad life decisions. I don't think we should do those things, right? And you could list those, you could list any of the other commandments or any of the things that Jesus taught. I think it's really, really powerful to be generous. I think a life of greed and stinginess is anti-Christ. I think you cannot become happy by gaining more things. And that's the temptation to talk about with this interactions, the only thing to talk about is, you should be more generous. Well, listen, I think you should be more generous. I should be more generous. We should live lives of generosity. That's the character and the nature of God. But it does you no good. There's this old great saying that you can give without loving. You can give out, I've given out of obligation before, or out of guilt. I felt guilty, but you cannot love without giving. You can give without loving, but you can't love without giving. See, you can do all of this stuff right. You can obey all the laws like this young man has, and Christ may still not have your heart. Something else may have your heart. Something else may own you, rather than you belonging to Christ. Now, I don't pretend to know what that thing could be today. I know the stuff in my life that it has owned me, that I have placed in front of Christ at different times in my life. And you may be able to articulate it. You may not even be able to articulate it. And the idea that Christ wants something different. Now, he doesn't want something more from you. He wants something different from you. I think it's great. It brings joy to my heart when I see people give generously. It brings joy to my heart when I see someone be honest when lying could have got them out of the situation. Isn't it refreshing to be around someone of integrity and honesty and virtue? Yeah. That's all amazing. And I think those things should come. But I think those things, without our hearts belonging to Christ, become religious activities. Good ones, but nonetheless, just habits and traditions that we do sometimes to make ourselves feel a little bit better this week than we did last week. Because we did a few more good deeds this week than we did last week. What I'm not saying is stop doing good deeds, right? I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is, that is not what Christ is after. That'll come. I think that's great. But what Christ is after was not this kid obeying the 10 Commandments. He was after the young man's heart. After his heart. How much more meaningful is it to tell the truth before you're called to the stand and required to tell the truth before God and everyone else? You're required to, and the penalty for lying is jail time. Then you're obligated. Then you're required. Or how about getting caught? That's my favorite, when you have to tell the truth after you get caught. Because before telling the truth, well, it would have got you in trouble. Now it's like, well, you've got the emails or whatever you got. You know what I'm saying? You've got the truth, so now I have to confess it. How much more powerful would it have been if you would have just confessed the truth earlier, before you got caught? Hey, you don't know this is going on, but I'm just going to tell you. That comes from a different place than requirement, right? If you think that, or if your assumption is, I need to get to church, and I need to pray, and I need to read the Bible, so that in several years from now, I don't end up burning in hell for eternity. I mean, that's good motivation. Right? That's pretty good motivation. I don't want to either. But what kind of thing are we signed up for here? That's the whole deal, is our goal is to get some fire insurance for the hereafter. Right? That can't be what the whole point is. That couldn't have been Jesus' actual job title. Eternity fire insurance salesman. But sometimes we treat our Christian faith as if it's about everything but what it's really about. Because what Jesus is after, guys, is our heart. And I think with that, when Christ has our heart, I think generosity comes. I think obedience comes. I think living according to Scripture, I think that comes. But let's not get it flipped around on what it's not. To be Christian means to belong to to Christ, and not just in our actions, but deep within us. Deep within us. Our hearts, for lack of a better word, our hearts to belong to Christ. I think this story and several others. Today I feel like I could have read about 20 different interactions Jesus had. I think this story stirs up several questions. I think probably as I was reading it, like 5 or 6 or 7 questions popped to my head, not about you, but about me. Just about me and my life, and questions I have to face, and things I need to change when I read the scripture. But one question that kept kind of rising to the top was not really about money whatsoever. I had to continue to ask myself, and so I'm just going to kind of bring you in on my own little personal life and ask us together this question. Does Christ have your heart? Or is there the possibility that something else might? No, what I'm not saying is, I'm not asking you to question, am I even a Christian? No. I'm just asking, if Christ has your heart, does he have this supreme spot in your heart? Does he have the number one spot? Is he the center of your life? Is he the center of my life? Or is there something maybe that has his spot? Maybe a good question is to ask it the way Jesus asked it. Is there something that if Jesus asked you today to give up or give away to follow him, there'd be hesitation or maybe even a no? I think that's maybe a good way to ask the question on whether or not Christ has your heart. Is there something? Is there someone? Is there something in your life that if Christ were to ask you today, would you be willing to give this up for me? You would hesitate. Whoa, what? But look at all this other stuff I've done, Lord. You know what I'm saying? That at least gives me a pass through this one. Or you may not even hesitate. You know for a fact, no, Lord, I could not give that up to follow you. I don't know what it is. For this young man, we know what his was. That may not be yours. It may be something else. Maybe something else. I'm assuming that there's a bunch of us here today that could say, no, there's nothing. There's nothing that I could not give up to follow Christ. Listen, I think it's beautiful. I think that's beautiful. And I think we should always be the type of people that stand guard of our hearts, so allow nothing ever to sneak in and gain that number one spot. But I also know that we're not all at the same spot in our lives. And so I'm assuming if there are some of us that are in a spot where nothing could take the place of Christ in our hearts, and I'm assuming there are some of us that would be in the spot that we would say, Dan, I would hesitate at this, or this. I would maybe even, I know today, I'd say no. If Christ was asking me, if I was that young man and he asked me about this thing, whatever this thing is, I would hesitate. I'm not sure I could do it. I think that is the majority of the battle, is being willing to admit Christ doesn't have supreme spot in my heart. It's a tough thing to have to admit. It's a tough thing to be willing to admit to yourself, let alone maybe somebody else. And so what do we do if we ever get into a spot where Christ is no longer the center of our hearts? Our lives don't belong to Christ. Well, what do we do? What do we do then? The key is in the verse. In verse 21, is to realize this. Jesus looked at the man and felt genuine love for him. This young man walked away from Christ when he was challenged with what had hold of his heart. What Jesus wanted, his genuine love, would have opened his arms up and said, I don't know if I can give that up, Lord, but I want to. Jesus would have embraced him wholeheartedly. Oftentimes we shrink away when there is something that we feel like should not be in our hearts. But what Christ wants from us is run to his genuine love for us, because through him, through his strength and through his guidance and through his wisdom, he can once again hold supreme place in your heart, or for some of us, for the very first time. time. Now here's what I want to end the service. I just want to say a prayer for you. And again, I don't know if Christ holds the center of your heart today, if there's something else that your heart belongs to. I don't know if the stuff that you own owns you, and I don't know if the stuff that you have has you. I don't know if that's it. If there's a whole other thing that might have your heart today, that can all change, not by jumping through more hoops. There aren't more commandments coming down to you today, and more things that you have to do, and more clubs you have to join, and more groups you have to attend. There is just genuine love and forgiveness and hope that everything can change. And once again, your lives, or for the very first time, your lives can belong to Christ. So I want to pray for you. Would you bow your heads with me? Well, God, I know that it wasn't an accident that Mark, by your Spirit, chose this story to write and for it to speak to us 2,000 years later. What it speaks to us about is our hearts. And Father, my prayer today is that all of us, no matter how long we've been a Christ follower, or if today that we're not a Christ follower, irregardless of the position that we're in our spiritual lives, that we would take inventory of our heart. Is there anything in my heart that I could not give up for Christ? Is there anything in my life that I'd hesitate to say no to follow Jesus? With your heads bowed for just a moment, your eyes closed, I'm not going to ask anyone to stand up or even raise their hand. I just want you to take inventory of your heart. Is there anything? Anything that has a firmer grip on your heart than Jesus Christ? It's okay to laugh during prayer. Is there anything? Well, Father, I pray today that if there is, in my heart, my family's heart, my church family's heart, those up in the main bar, those watching online, I pray today we would run to you, that we would start to make those changes in our lives, that our hearts would belong to you, that being a Christian would be much more than just hoops to jump through or laws to obey, but it would be about our hearts belonging to Christ, to be in a real, living and thriving relationship with your Son, Jesus Christ. I pray that for everyone here today. In Jesus' name. The Flora-Bama family said,
thank you, Dan. Hey, thank you everybody for joining us today. Be sure to pick up one of these invite cards, or maybe 2 or 3, or stack, and take them and give them out to everybody. I'm going to invite everybody to stand. We say this every week. Romans 8 tells us that if God is for us, who can be against us? We'll see you next week.
Through you the blind will see. The mute will sing. Through you the dead will rise. Through you all hearts will praise. Through you the darkness flees. Through you my heart screams, I am free.